Frank Quarter Show, South Africa is a movie. And they are so excited because I am so excited. There's an absolutely phenomenal book that came out recently called Behind Prison Walls. It has absolutely fascinated me. There are 3 co-authors, and what they're writing about is how South Africa, in the new South Africa, made a set of decisions that, if anything, didn't improve apartheid prisons that much, and ultimately became places where more and more people who were in prison, some of them not even convicted, awaiting trial still, were exposed to violence and poor resources and poor environments, which, if anything, made them victims and in some cases forced them into criminality that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And so tonight, in this interview that we're going to have with 2 of the co-authors, I've interviewed the 3rd one somewhere else in Cape Town recently, we're going to talk about, are we doing prisons all wrong in South Africa? Are prisons actually making our society worse and doing very little to make it better? And for that, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome 2 of the 3 writers. The 3rd is Rebecca Gore. But here tonight are Sohela Surajpal and Justice Edwin Cameron, everybody. I very rarely openly fanboy over my guests, but guys, that is such a phenomenal book. So you 2 both work for JIX. Just to start, because I never heard of JIX, and I'm oddly legally and news obsessed in this country. I think a lot of people don't know about it. Sohela, could you tell us what JIX is about, and also just what it stands for?
So JIX is the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services. Which means we are our country's statutory prisons oversight body. So our job is to conduct prison inspections, investigations, handle complaints from inmates, all to make sure that prisoners' rights are being upheld, they're being treated in a fair and dignified way, and that conditions in our prisons comply with our constitutional and our legal standards.
And even just from reading a little bit of this book that I really encourage everybody to go and get their hands on, what is clear is that most of our prisons at the moment are in a state of real disrepair, are awful not just for the prisoners but for the people who work there, the kind of enforcers of the rules, but also the people who are supposed to be working in rehab programs with prisoners themselves. Why is it so dire right now? Is it classic South African modern ANC-led government decay and neglect and lack of care? Is it something else? Is it both?
It's a tough question, and I think many reasons, but I think the main reason is overcrowding. We just have too many people in our prisons. We have space for about 106,000 people in our prisons. We have a lot of prisons, 243. But we actually incarcerate about 160,000 people. And it's a number that continues to climb in a worrying and scary way. And so we go to prisons and we see cells that are designed to hold 20 people, maybe 30 people maximum. And those cells are actually holding 70, 80 people. There's just no way, even if you have dedicated staff, even if you have the best intentions in the world, that dealing with that number of people is ever going to be possible to do in a humane, dignified way. So I think that's the main problem. But there are definitely others.
And there are many people watching right now thinking, oh, okay, the answer to that is just to build more prisons. But this book does not say that, and that's what I'm so excited to dig into in a bit. Justice Cameron, the book starts with you writing about your experience of the apartheid prison system as a young, starting out lawyer, and with a particular perspective on how the apartheid prison system's goal was to criminalize and destroy the lives of people fighting against the apartheid state, but also to mass criminalize and incarcerate people of color in South Africa. And that led to an incredibly inhumane prison system that ultimately sometimes manifested in the death penalty being so terrible. And so all of your writing then moves to, what did we need to do after 1994 to not let that happen again? You guys wrote about basically saying that the death penalty would not happen in South Africa because we as a country didn't want to have the soul of a country that would kill its own citizens. And there are other arguments about the death penalty. But then you all write about how in the late 90s and early 2000s, something went wrong. Everyone was very scared of crime. People thought there was an uptick of crime. There's not much good evidence to suggest that that was happening. But there was this feeling that South Africans were in danger of crime, and also some American influence. What exactly happened?
I think that black and white South Africans were in trepidation after the transition. We were very joyful, but also scared about how the new government would manage governance of this complex apartheid historied country. And part of that anxiety was about crime. The facts show, Dan, that from 1994 until 2011, the crime rate, especially the violent crime rate, the murder rate, came down. And that's a lesson for today, because what happened in 2011 is that President Jacob Zuma started destroying the institutions that contain crime, especially crime intelligence. He appointed a shady character to head crime intelligence. It's never recovered. 15 years later, there's still shady people in crime intelligence. The police, the National Prosecuting Authority, also the tax service. So all the institutions of our country which were defective under apartheid, which could have been expanded in our democratic state, under the Zuma presidency, they were broken down. And that's what's led to the uptick. Since 2011, there's been an almost consistent uptick, almost a doubling of the murder rate, to the terrible position where we are now.
And that links to what did happen in the early 2000s. A lot of people think that the way you stop someone from committing a crime is you have a really harsh punishment. So if you're in school and you know that detention's no longer a thing, if you speak in class, you're going to get expelled, right? People think, oh, you'll change the way that, like you won't speak in class so much. But what if I told you your teacher was deaf? You would still speak in class, even though the punishment was so terrible, because you knew you wouldn't get caught. And that's actually what happens when people are deciding whether or not to commit a crime. They are making the judgment call not on how harsh the penalty will be, the severity. They're making a judgment call on how likely it would be that they got caught. And since 2011, no criminals think they're going to get caught, because we all know we live in a country where criminals don't get caught and people get away with it. But in the early 2000s, people thought maybe if we more harshly punished criminals, it would cause crime to go down, which was Justice Cameron, I think, an American-infused thing. But what did our government actually decide to do in the early 2000s that's now caused, in part, this overcrowding disaster?
We call it sentence inflation, over-incarceration, more and more crimes for fewer and fewer people. You've made an important point, Dan, which is that at the moment, Sohela did a rough calculation for our book with Rebecca Gore. She took the figures for annual murders, which are terrific, 27,000, horrifying number. And then they looked at the number of successful prosecutions that the National Prosecuting Authority does of murders. 11% of murders. So 89% of murders are going unprosecuted, unpunished. So we are sending fewer and fewer violent perpetrators to prison for longer and longer. And in the book we say that that's all the wrong way around.
Sohela, could you explain to me about what mandatory minimum sentencing is and why it's caused fewer people in our jails, but people staying for much longer in our jails?
So on the face of it, mandatory minimum sentences seem to make sense. The idea is that you're introducing some consistency. A judge who's deciding, I've found someone guilty, I need to determine an appropriate sentence, isn't just pulling a number out of a hat. They're saying the statute says this many years for this specific crime, unless there are exceptional circumstances that would justify deviating from that. The problem is that when we adopted mandatory minimum sentences, we didn't just make them consistent, we also made them much harsher than they were before. And one thing we did in particular was expand the category of offenses that automatically attract a life sentence, as well as generally make crimes attract longer and longer sentences. And so the number we like to share with people is that in 1995, when we transitioned to democracy, there were about 400 people sentenced to life in our prisons. Now there are about 18,000 people sentenced to life in our prisons. So it's a massive inflation. But not only did we make sentences longer, we also made it harder to get parole. It used to be you committed a serious crime, you got a life sentence, you had to serve 10 years before you became eligible for parole. This was during apartheid. Now you have to serve 25 years before you become eligible for parole. And that only means you can make your first application, but the minister still has to decide whether to grant parole. And our current minister has a very low approval rate for life of parole. So that means people are going to prison for longer, they're only getting out after a much longer period, and that has really driven up the number of people in our prisons.
And clearly not made South Africa safer. Clearly, obviously not made South Africa safer. And Justice Cameron, you guys write in the book very well about how, honestly, beyond a certain amount of time, keeping someone in prison longer does not dissuade them from coming out and committing crimes any more than before. There's interesting data about how the older you get, the less likely you are to commit a crime at all. But of course, because the prison system themselves, the prisons are in such a state of disrepair, people in prison, if they stay in longer, are not coming out better rehabilitated. They are more likely to come out victims of crimes that happened within prison, or being forced to take a horrible deal and become part of gangs in prisons just to survive.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we should be educating prisoners. Some education does work. We went to Mossel Bay Youth Centre, which is for under 21s. We saw 16 children under 18, the youngest 15, in what we can only describe as very horrible circumstances. But amongst the sentenced youngsters, we found that they were going to school, they were playing rugby and soccer. One guy, Sampiwe, stood up and said, please can't you let us introduce boxing as well? So there are points of light, Dan, and I would like to go back to one of your early questions, because you were comparing it to the general degradation of governance functions in our country. I must say that the prisons are better than what I think and what I read and hear and understand is happening in most government entities. And I do give credit, there is corruption. That's how the cell phones get into the cells. That's how the drugs get into the cells. But most of the warders, 30,000 plus prison staff, are honest people who are doing a tough job to the best of their ability. So even in the circumstances we saw at Mossel Bay, where those 16 kids, as I said, the youngest of 15, were in what we thought were terrible conditions, the warders were responsive. They cared about what we said. So it's not a uniform picture, but the fact is that our prisons are not doing what Mandela said in the statute passed in his parliament, which was reintegration, re-education, learning skills in prisons, because not enough resources are dedicated to learning skills in prisons. We have personnel who want to do it, but they're not given the funding.
And so it begs the question, what do we do about our prison system that is so fundamentally not making our country safer, not diminishing crime, and becoming crime hotspots, the prisons themselves, for more crimes to happen? And so that's where the second half of the book, Behind Prison Walls, excites me so much. Strap in, folks, because these ideas about prisons, although they've been done in places, they've been done, open-air prisons are in Zambia, and they've been done in Scandinavia and Holland. Some of them are going to seem quite far out, but may do a way better job of achieving what we're trying to achieve with prisons, which is rehabilitation, which is the ability for prisoners to go back into society as functioning members of society, and for prisons not to be hellscapes that make new victims from crimes. Sohela, I want to start. Can we start with open-air prisons, actually? Because that's the example I really like, because it's happening and happened in Africa already. So what's the philosophy behind it, and why might it be a good idea? And how is, maybe let me start, why is an open-air prison different to what we have now?
Well, at the moment, our prisons are closed off, isolated. I imagine most people in the audience, most people watching, have never seen the inside of a prison, and that's by design. It's hard to get access to a prison. The idea is that you are locking these very dangerous people away, they cannot harm you. But in actuality, prisons are porous. Our co-author Rebecca likes to compare prisons to a revolving door. People are constantly entering and leaving. An open-air prison makes that slightly more tangible. The idea is that if you want people to successfully reintegrate upon their release, you can't keep them locked up, isolated in a completely foreign environment run by strict rules and hierarchy, and then one day throw them out into the open world and expect them to survive. And so what open-air prisons do is they allow some level of movement in and out of the prison, and that can happen in degrees. In Austria, for example, there are prisons where people are detained in the prison. It's a secure facility, but they can leave during the day to study at university or at school, or to work normal jobs outside. What that can help do is prevent major disruptions to their life. Imagine you're sentenced to a year in prison. You are going to leave, and you're going to need, especially if we don't want you to fall into a life of crime when you're released, you're going to need a job, and you're going to need work, and you're going to need a support system. What being able to leave means is that you maintain that support system, you maintain some level of normalcy while still being punished by having your liberty deprived of you in some way.
And also crucially helps the dependence on people who go to jail, because often there are friends and or their family members who rely on the money of a breadwinner who then ends up in prison. So it's important to remember that. Also, as far as I understand from the book, there are certain prisons where prisoners are just given way more autonomy in prison to run things. Like basically like fewer guards and more like, well, someone has got to run the bakery, somebody's got to cook, somebody's got to wash the toilets, and a more like hands-off, like try to create your own society within that can function, right?
And ironically, Dan, sadly, South Africa's got a long gang culture in their prisons, going back to Nongoloza in the 1910s, 120, 30 years ago. So the gangs are powerful, and the gangs are dangerous, and the warders are at risk of them. So often you find that the gang leaders are running cartels outside prison with the help of corrupt personnel, but you often find that they play a big role in running the prison anyway.
Right.
So it's not as though this is a novelty, it's just a reshaping of a corrupt system into one that is well functioning.
Yeah, that happens anyway. Yeah, for sure. So what are some of the more far out ones? You had a twinkle in your eye during the ad break.
I did. And I'm delighted we've got a young receptive audience. Dan, I want to say one thing first before I tell the way out idea. The first thing I want to say is that we recognize in the book that people are scared. We are scared. All of us are scared. And if I think we ask our audience tonight, how many of them have had home invasions? How many of them have been affected by violent crime? A lot of people will answer. And so we say fix crime intelligence as an imperative starting tonight. We say start fixing the SAPS. Don't appoint no-hopers, goners, and shady people to head the SAPS at all levels, all nine provinces. And we say fix the NPA. Give Shamila Batoy. Why did the president take 2 years to suspend Andrew Chauke, the head of prosecutions in the biggest province? So that's where we start. Then the idea. We say that there is carnage on the Cape Flats, and that carnage is caused by gangs who are controlling the drug trade. We say they are controlling the drug trade because of the criminalization of drugs. And we say follow those countries that have started deregulating the criminalization of the drug trade. We realize it's a big idea, but we are helped by former President Kgalema Motlanthe, who is a distinguished man, a distinguished, thoughtful man who is widely respected in our country. He signed a declaration together with South and Central American presidents, the president of Switzerland, who says, stop this criminal war. Stop it. You are creating more criminals. You're creating more deaths. And we are confident that if they reconfigure the criminalization of drugs, that the carnage that is happening now, tonight, on the Cape Flats will come down.
Essentially, some form of like limited legalization of drugs, such that there's a formal economy to do the or like to trade in the drugs, such that gangs don't have a monopoly over the drug trade.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please.
Dan, we know that smoking is dangerous. It's very dangerous. Tens of thousands of people die. Tens of thousands, millions have their health impaired. We know that alcohol is dangerous. There's more and more evidence that alcohol is dangerous. We don't send people to jail for selling cigarettes or alcohol. We don't send them to jail for using those things. And we say, consider doing the same with drugs.
And if cigarettes and alcohol were illegal, as they have been, for example, in Prohibition America 100 years ago, that makes people drink and smoke anyway. It's just from unregulated sources that are not overseen by a health authority and run by criminal networks.
Mafia.
Which empowers mafia networks. I kind of like that idea, although now people are going to say that I just want a little bit of something. But that's not the point. So when I was speaking to your third musketeer, your co-author Rebecca Gore, she was talking about how a real problem in South Africa that contributes to so many people sitting in jail awaiting trial is that many people can't even put together 1,000 rand or 500 rand to afford bail, which is an amount of money that should not keep someone awaiting trial who's not even been found guilty of anything yet in jail and out of their normal lives. And so there's a big argument about whether or not we should just have bail without any financial penalty. But Rebecca was talking about how, I believe it's all three of you, amongst others, are involved in trying to create a public fund that will pay the bail of people who have been given very small amounts of bail but are in such poverty or financial need that they can't even pay that amount of bail. So that at least, and remember, they might be found innocent, right? Or they might go to jail for 6 months or a year. At least they aren't stuck waiting for months to years in a prison cell awaiting trial. How would that work, that kind of fund or like public pocket to be able to pay people's bails?
Well, you've described it quite well already, Dan.
Okay, what is the plan, maybe?
But the idea is people shouldn't be in prison because they're poor. And with prisoners of poverty, as we call them, they've been granted bail. That means a court has decided you are not a risk. If I let you go while the trial proceeds, while we determine whether or not you're guilty, you won't harass witnesses, you won't run away, you will probably show up for your trial date. Bail really is only supposed to ensure that a person in the end shows up for their trial. It's not supposed to be part of the punishment, which is how a lot of us think about it. And so the idea is that people who've been granted bail amounts of 1,000 rand or less, and I mean, we've met people who are in prison for months because they can't afford bail of 300 rand, 200 rand, amounts we would spend on a single night's supper or on Uber Eats. Those are keeping people in the most degraded, inhumane conditions. What we say is, as a bail fund, a private fund funded by donations from charities, from private individuals, we would pay that bail for you so that you can leave. We also know when people aren't detained awaiting trial, they have a much higher likelihood of being found innocent. They can represent themselves better, they can consult with lawyers better, including legal aid lawyers. And what we would like to do is also then to provide them with support that makes sure they do actually show up for their trial. So we find, and research shows, that sometimes the reason people don't show up for their trial is because they get confused about their trial date. Their trial has been postponed multiple times. They're not very literate. They're not sure when they're supposed to show up. And so simply texting people reminders of their trial dates makes a huge difference, or helping them with childcare or with transport to court. And so we'd like to help pay for bail, and as the project expands, because we're now about to launch a pilot project in the Western Cape, a very limited version of the project to gather data to figure out whether this really works, as it expands to also start providing other support. And I think it links to the drug issue, which is that prisons aren't an answer to all the many social issues we have in our country. And we need to start being more imaginative about how to actually solve those problems.
Thank you so much. Justice Cameron, I want to end with you because we've only got, I'm going to run over time. It's fine. I'm enjoying this too much. So both of you and your co-author, Rebecca Gore, are like well-versed in how movements to try and improve our law and our country develop, and why some of them succeed and some of them fail. And broadly, South Africans right now are saying, what can we do? What even works to try and arrest the slide that a lot of this country and parts of our society is facing? Justice Cameron, specifically for this, how can people support you guys and get involved? But also more broadly, like, how can we citizens be acting to try and stop things from going wrong? Like, this is all that we keep talking. This show is basically, things are going wrong. What can we do?
Dan, you're absolutely right that we can do things, and we all have agency, we all have power, we all have voices. And one of the things we can do is for civil society. Right now, civil society is up in arms about the criminal gangsters who appear to be taking hold right within the highest reaches of our government and the highest reach of police. So let me give an example, Dan. I'm on antiretrovirals myself. In fact, in November, it'll be 28 years. We had a crisis of governance under President Mbeki when he refused to accept the science of AIDS and the science of ARVs, which by that stage had saved my life. That's why I'm here today. But civil society stepped in. They went to the courts. They formed the treatment action campaign, Zaki Ahmed. And civil society won the victory, which led to us now, tonight, having the world's largest publicly provided antiretroviral treatment campaign. Many of our audience have sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles, parents who are receiving antiretrovirals like I do. We are 7 million in our country. So that's to me an inspiring example of what we can do. There have been movements in other countries, anti-crime movements, anti-corruption movements. We see what happened in Nepal when government didn't listen. We hope our government will listen, but we can do a lot.
Amazing. Well, they're amazing. Thank you so much to Justice Edwin Cameron and Surajpal. Go buy the book. Go buy Behind Prison Walls.